In the vast desert of North Africa, soldiers of the Axis expected to face tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft. But what arrived with the Americans in 1942 was something far smaller, yet far more unsettling. A compact, dust-covered vehicle rolled down the ramps of Allied ships and began appearing everywhere. On ridgelines, in villages across terrain the Germans believed impassable. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but it changed the rhythm of the war. The Jeep became the unexpected symbol of an enemy whose strength lay not only in firepower, but in movement, coordination, and relentless supply. When American forces landed in North Africa on November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, most German and Italian officers knew the United States possessed industrial capacity far beyond anything the Axis could match. What they did not know, what they could not yet imagine, was how this strength would manifest itself on the battlefield. In the first hours after the landings in Morocco and Algeria, they received a small but unmistakable sign. Rolling down improvised ramps, bouncing over uneven piers, weaving through the dust of hastily captured harbors, came a compact, open-topped vehicle that looked almost too simple for war. It was the American Jeep, designated at the time as the Willys MB, and its Ford-built twin, the GPW. The North African theater had already been shaped by years of combat. Italy had invaded Egypt in 1940, Britain had counterattacked and advanced deep into Libya. Germany had intervened in early 1941 to stabilize the front. The Africa Corps, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had created a reputation for daring maneuvers and expert use of limited resources. But by late 1942, the situation had changed. The Axis still controlled Libya and parts of Tunisia, while the French territories of Morocco and Algeria remained under the authority of Vichy France. The arrival of the Americans forced a new phase of the campaign, one in which logistics, mobility, and speed would matter as much as armored weight or tactical brilliance. It was in this context that the Jeep made its first impression on the German side. Unlike British or German vehicles already fighting in the desert, the American Jeep embodied the philosophy of mass production. It was not designed to be elegant or complex. It was designed to function, endure, and be repaired anywhere. Its flat fenders, square body, and open frame seemed almost crude compared to German engineering. Yet its simplicity was deceptive. Under the hood was a reliable four-cylinder engine that started in heat, dust, and rough weather. The vehicle's low weight and true four-wheel drive allowed it to cross sand, rocks, wadis, and broken roads with ease. German reconnaissance units, accustomed to motorcycles and light cars like the Kübelwagen, were surprised to see a machine that could maneuver across terrain they considered unsuitable for wheels. Local French officers loyal to Vichy were equally struck by the vehicle's confidence. They had seen American films and magazines before the war, but watching dozens of these machines race from beaches to inland roads, carrying officers, radio operators, improvised medical teams, and platoons of riflemen, gave them a clear sense that the United States brought something fundamentally new to the theater. The Jeep was not merely a transport. It was the connective tissue of an army arriving with enormous energy. For the Germans, monitoring the landings from Tunisia, the first reports were technical and understated. Intelligence summaries noted that American light cars appear numerous and 444 utility vehicles demonstrate good cross-country mobility. Even Rommel's staff, accustomed to evaluating enemy vehicles, initially dismissed the Jeep as a small English-type utility car. But as more reports came in, the tone shifted. Patrols observing American columns noted that these vehicles seemed to move everywhere, on ridgelines, in dried riverbeds, through villages, and along narrow coastal tracks. It became clear that the Americans used them not only as runabouts, but as essential tools of their battlefield system. Part of what made the Jeep so striking to officers of the Africa Corps was the contrast with their own logistical reality. Germany was fighting a long, fragile supply war across the Mediterranean. Each truck, each tire, and each liter of fuel had to be shipped under Allied naval and air pressure. Vehicles often broke down from heat and overuse, and replacement parts were slow to arrive. The Italians faced similar problems. Seeing the Americans deploy hundreds of small vehicles immediately after landing, alongside trucks, tanks, and support machinery, revealed a difference that was not merely technological, but structural. Local civilians in Algiers and Oran, who had lived under rationing and colonial restrictions, also took notice. The Jeep, to them, represented not only military arrival, but a kind of American abundance. Crates stacked on docks, convoys of fuel, refrigerated cargo, and medical equipment. For them, the appearance of these machines symbolized a shift in the balance of power. A new actor had entered the conflict, and it brought more movement, more supplies, and more energy than the desert had seen in years. For the Americans themselves, the Jeep was so familiar that many did not realize how unusual it appeared to their adversaries. To them, it was simply the workhorse of the US Army, the vehicle that carried maps, radios, stretchers, ammunition, engineers, chaplains, and generals. It had been designed quickly in 1940 and adopted almost immediately, a product of the American belief that war demanded fast, practical solutions. As they drove inland from the torch beachheads, many soldiers joked that the Jeep felt like a piece of home with dust on it. But to German intelligence officers watching the rapid American expansion into Algeria, the implications were clear. The Jeep was a sign, not of American luxury, but of American capability. It represented a nation that could equip an army rapidly, uniformly, and in numbers that could overwhelm even experienced Axis forces. In North Africa, where movement determined survival, this small vehicle carried a message more significant than its size suggested. The United States had arrived, and it was prepared to fight a different kind of war. As the Americans expanded their foothold in North Africa after the torch landings, German and Italian officers began to observe a pattern that distinguished the new opponent from every army they had previously faced. It was not a specific weapon, nor a single strategy. It was a system built on standardization, volume, and practicality. And at the center of this system, visible in every village, every road, and every supply column, was the Jeep. For decades before the war, German engineering culture had emphasized precision. Vehicles like the Sun-Kfz 222 reconnaissance car or the Hawk transport series reflected that philosophy. Finely crafted, technically advanced, and designed to perform well under ideal circumstances. But the desert was not ideal. Heat-warped metal, sand, infiltrated machinery, and long supply lines meant that a broken axle or clogged carburetor could sideline a vehicle indefinitely. Even the much-admired Kübelwagen, though efficient on firm ground, struggled in loose desert sand. Its rear-wheel drive and low ground clearance often forced crews to resort to digging, pushing, or laying down mats for traction. The Jeep, by comparison, simply kept moving. Within weeks of the American arrival, German patrols noted that the Jeep's design, square, rugged, and seemingly unsophisticated, was giving the US Army an unexpected edge. Reports described how the vehicle climbed rocky slopes, crossed wadis after rainstorms, and maneuvered through broken terrain where heavier Axis vehicles bogged down. What seemed at first like a minor tactical detail gradually revealed itself as a strategic advantage. The Americans could move men, messages, and materials faster than the defenders of Tunisia could respond. The key lay in the Jeep's simplicity. Its four-cylinder Go Devil engine produced modest horsepower, but its reliability under strain far exceeded expectations. Mechanics could replace a fuel pump or water hose with minimal tools, and the entire engine could be removed in minutes. Axis maintenance crews, dealing with a diverse and sometimes mismatched fleet, lacked that privilege. German supply lines had to manage parts for Italian trucks, German half-tracks, captured British equipment, and a variety of specialized vehicles. The Americans, by contrast, brought vast numbers of identical machines. A broken Jeep could be cannibalized for parts, repaired quickly, or replaced outright. This uniformity created a mechanical rhythm that impressed even those inclined to underestimate American technology. The deeper the Allies pushed into Tunisia, the more noticeable the contrast became. British and Commonwealth forces, seasoned by years in the desert, adapted quickly to American supplies. They too began to rely on jeeps for reconnaissance and liaison tasks. Columns of these small vehicles dotted the front lines, their silhouettes crossing ridges at dawn or appearing suddenly on side roads. German artillery observers complained that American units seemed to multiply themselves, shifting positions faster than expected. Much of that mobility came from the jeep's ability to link units spread across wide stretches of rugged land. But the vehicle's impact extended beyond pure movement. Because it was small and agile, the Jeep became a natural carrier for radios, something crucial in a theater where communication often dictated survival. American units equipped their vehicles with SCR-508 and SCR-510 radio sets, enabling real-time coordination between armor, infantry, and air support. German units had radios as well, but they were often mounted in larger command vehicles or half-tracks, which were fewer in number and slower over rough ground. The ability to place radio-equipped jeeps at forward observation posts gave the Allies a flexible network that adapted quickly to battlefield changes. Medical evacuation offered another example of the jeep's versatility. American medics mounted stretchers over the rear and sides, creating makeshift ambulances capable of weaving through shell-damaged roads where larger vehicles could not pass. German medical units, often short on fuel or forced to rely on horse-drawn carts in remote areas, struggled to match this speed. The result was not only tactical, but human. Allied wounded frequently reached aid stations faster, increasing survival rates. Small efficiencies, multiplied across an army, produced meaningful outcomes. Logistically, the Jeep's impact was equally visible. Supply officers appreciated its low fuel consumption compared to German or Italian trucks. Every liter mattered in North Africa, and the Americans brought not only more fuel, but vehicles that used it efficiently. German diaries frequently reference shortages of gasoline, of spare parts, of rubber tires. The Jeep's rugged tires, combined with the vast American supply infrastructure, allowed it to remain operational even under harsh conditions that grounded Axis vehicles. All of this converged into a single observation repeated across captured German documents. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war. They compensated for lack of experience with organization and resources. They compensated for lack of desert familiarity with adaptability and relentless supply. And the Jeep, in its modest size, represented this shift better than any tank or aircraft. It was the machine that turned intention into action, linking battalions to depots, commanders to front lines, and ideas to execution. As Allied momentum grew, German officers began to question whether the Axis could maintain pace. For every Jeep destroyed, another appeared. For every logistical setback inflicted on the Americans, reinforcements arrived to compensate. What the Axis could not counter was the industrial logic behind the vehicle. It was built to be produced quickly, maintained easily, and replaced without hesitation. The Jeep was not a technological marvel. It was something far more effective in the context of total war, a dependable, standardized tool delivered in overwhelming numbers. And as the desert battles intensified, it became clear that this simple vehicle was reshaping the mobility balance in Tunisia, one dusty road at a time. By early 1943, the North African campaign had entered a decisive phase. The Axis, pressed between British forces advancing from the east and the growing American presence in Algeria and western Tunisia, found itself fighting a two-front struggle across terrain that punished any army unable to move quickly and efficiently. In this critical moment, the American Jeep demonstrated why mobility, more than armor or firepower, would determine the outcome of the North African War. The terrain of Tunisia was a world apart from the sweeping sands of Libya or the open spaces of Egypt. Here, mountains, narrow passes, rocky plateaus, and olive groves created a mosaic of barriers. German units, especially those under experienced commanders from the Afrika Korps, tried to use this geography to their advantage. The strategy relied on rapid counterattacks, carefully chosen defensive lines, and the ability to shift forces before Allied pressure could build. But moving forces required vehicles, spare parts, and fuel, resources the Axis increasingly struggled to supply. The Americans, on the other hand, relied on a network of Jeep-supported mobility that allowed them to adapt quickly to the unexpectedly complex Tunisian landscape. The Jeep became the forward element of every advance, scouting routes before armored units committed to them. Small teams, often just 2 or 3 vehicles, pushed ahead of the main force, mapping trails, identifying ambush positions, and reporting back by radio. German troops frequently encountered these reconnaissance patrols in places where they did not expect Allied forces to appear, across ridgelines, on goat paths, or near dried riverbeds that local guides believed impassable for vehicles. Reports from German field commanders reflected this surprise. One intelligence summary noted that American light motor patrols exhibit an unusual ability to bypass obstacles. Another described an engagement where American Jeeps appeared suddenly on the flank of a German defensive line, having crossed a hillside path that German commanders believed unsuitable for wheeled vehicles. These moments were not dramatic in isolation. The Jeep did not overwhelm positions by firepower or shock. Instead, it allowed the Allies to gather information faster than the Axis, a crucial factor in a theater where visibility and terrain dictated tactical success. The Jeep's role in supporting artillery was equally significant. American artillery doctrine emphasized rapid response and flexibility. Forward observers, often traveling in Jeeps, could position themselves closer to the front and adjust positions frequently to maintain line of sight. With reliable radio sets mounted on the vehicles, observers coordinated with artillery batteries miles behind the lines. This system allowed American forces to call in fire missions with speed that frequently caught German units off guard. Axis accounts describe artillery concentrations appearing with little warning, targeting assembly points or disrupting counterattacks just as they were forming. The Jeep also played a role in unifying operations between American and British forces. Tunisia required coordination between armies accustomed to different doctrines, equipment, and operational traditions. The British First Army, advancing from Algeria, and the US the II Corps needed continuous fast communication across widely dispersed units. Commanders used Jeeps to move between headquarters, to gather intelligence, and to ensure that troops in isolated valleys or rugged passes remained in contact with the wider plan. The speed and reliability of these movements reduced the delays that often plagued coalition warfare. Meanwhile, the Axis struggled with mobility in ways that had nothing to do with tactical skill. Fuel shortages forced German commanders to ration vehicle use. Some units were instructed to limit movement to essential combat operations only, which hampered reconnaissance and delayed repositioning. Italian units, already short on motor transport, often relied on mules or marched long distances on foot. German diaries note frustration with receiving orders to mount counterattacks, only to discover that half-tracks or trucks lacked the fuel to carry them out. Broken vehicles lined the roads, awaiting spare parts that seldom arrived. The contrast was visible to any observer on the ground. The Jeep also contributed to battlefield endurance by enabling rapid medical evacuation. In Tunisia, rough terrain made it difficult for larger ambulances to reach wounded soldiers. Jeeps, modified to carry stretchers, could move across narrow trails, bringing casualties to aid stations far more quickly than Axis forces could manage. German medical units, short on vehicles and fuel, often had to leave wounded soldiers in forward positions until nightfall or rely on improvised stretchers carried by hand. The difference in evacuation speed affected morale on both sides. Soldiers knew how quickly help could or could not reach them. Perhaps the most telling sign of the Jeep's influence appeared after several engagements in central Tunisia. German officers observed that American forces could rapidly reinforce positions that appeared vulnerable only hours before. A defensive line that seemed weak in the morning could be strengthened by afternoon, with fresh platoons arriving via Jeep-supported convoys. The Axis, facing limited mobility, could not match this tempo. Even when German tactical plans were sound, they often unfolded too slowly to counter the Allies' ability to shift manpower at will. As the campaign progressed toward its final battles around the Tunisian strongholds of Tunis and Bizerte, the Jeep had become something more than a transport vehicle. It was a tool of operational coherence, a means by which the Americans maintained tempo, cohesion, and awareness in a complex battle space. The Axis still possessed experienced commanders and skilled soldiers, but the material reality of movement had shifted. The Americans, supported by British logistics and their own industrial might, could initiate operations faster, sustain them longer, and recover from setbacks with greater efficiency. By spring 1943, it was clear that mobility, not just firepower, was reshaping the campaign. And in the dust-covered valleys and rocky hills of Tunisia, no vehicle embodied that new rhythm of war more clearly than the Jeep. By the early months of 1943, the psychological landscape of the North African front had shifted in ways that statistics alone could not capture. For the Axis troops fighting in Tunisia, the war had become a contest not only of equipment and resources, but of endurance, mental as much as physical. The presence of the American Jeep, multiplied across every road and hillside, became an unexpected symbol of this growing disparity. It was not that the Jeep itself caused panic or despair. Rather, it represented a broader truth that many German and Italian soldiers began to recognize. The Allies could move, supply, reinforce, and recover at a pace the Axis could no longer match. German diaries and letters from the period frequently mention exhaustion, shortages, and the sense of fighting an opponent whose numbers and means seemed to increase every week. Fuel was often the first concern. Entire units were ordered to remain stationary unless engaged in combat, and supply officers struggled to allocate small quantities of gasoline to the most essential vehicles. When American forces advanced, German commanders often knew what needed to be done: fall back to a more defensible line, mount a counterattack, or send reconnaissance teams to assess Allied strength, but lacked the mobility to execute these decisions. The Jeep, omnipresent in the Allied ranks, contrasted sharply with the immobilized trucks, half-tracks, and motorcycles of the Afrika Korps. This imbalance contributed to a shift in morale. German soldiers, especially those who had fought alongside Rommel in earlier campaigns, were accustomed to rapid maneuvers and bold offensives. But now, instead of sweeping across deserts, they found themselves reacting to Allied pressure, often arriving too late to secure key passes or prevent encirclement. The Allies, supported by jeeps that carried radios and officers across rugged ground, coordinated with precision. A German unit might hold a defensive ridge in the morning, only to discover by afternoon that Allied forces had flanked them, guided by reconnaissance teams using vehicles that navigated terrain the Germans had deemed impractical. Italian troops faced even greater difficulties. Many lacked adequate motor transport altogether, and supply issues were acute. Their letters and reports referenced long marches, unreliable vehicles, and limited rations. The sight of Allied jeeps delivering ammunition, water, and reinforcements reinforced the perception that the Americans were equipped for a long war, while the Axis was fighting with diminishing resources. Even when Axis troops performed effectively in combat, they could not ignore the broader logistical imbalance. The psychological impact was not limited to transportation. The jeep became central to Allied command and control operations. American officers used the vehicles to move frequently between units, inspecting positions, giving orders, and relaying updates. This mobility allowed Allied commanders, many still inexperienced in large-scale warfare, to maintain close contact with the battlefield. German intelligence reports noted this pattern, highlighting the unusually high number of officers seen near frontline positions. The Axis interpreted this as a sign that the Americans were willing to adapt quickly, learning from British experience and adjusting tactics as needed. The jeep, once again, served as the enabling instrument of this adaptation. Allied soldiers, for their part, gained confidence from their logistical superiority. They could see firsthand how quickly supplies reached them, how often officers visited their positions, and how efficiently wounded comrades were evacuated. The effect on morale was profound. Battles remained difficult and casualties significant, yet the sense of being part of a well-supported and well-supplied army sustained many units through the hardest phases of the Tunisian campaign. The Axis, meanwhile, experienced the opposite. Even experienced officers struggled to maintain optimism in the face of mounting shortages. Captured German reports from early 1943 described the Allies as materially overwhelming, a phrase that captured the growing realization that the Americans' ability to move resources, fuel, ammunition, reinforcements was wearing down Axis resistance more effectively than direct combat alone. The jeep's role in evacuation further contributed to the psychological divide. American medical teams used jeeps to transport wounded soldiers from forward positions to aid stations with remarkable speed. These improvised ambulances could traverse terrain that larger vehicles could not, saving time that often meant the difference between life and death. German medics lacked similar mobility. Severe fuel restrictions forced them to conserve vehicle use, and in many areas, wounded soldiers had to be carried long distances on foot or by mule. The disparity was not lost on the troops involved. The symbolism became unmistakable in the final months of the Tunisian campaign. Allied columns advancing toward Tunis and Bizerte often included long lines of jeeps moving alongside trucks, tanks, and artillery units. These vehicles carried maps, radios, engineers, scouts, reconnaissance teams, medics, and liaison officers. The Axis, short on vehicles and fuel, struggled to maintain coherent defensive lines. When breakthroughs occurred, German and Italian forces frequently lacked the means to reposition quickly enough to prevent further Allied gains. By April 1943, the psychological weight of this disparity was evident. German commanders could no longer pretend that better training or tactical skill would compensate for the Allies' logistical strength. Many Axis soldiers spoke privately of an enemy that simply had more of everything. The jeep, present in every phase of Allied operations, served as the most visible symbol of this reality. Its presence reminded the Axis that the Americans could outpace, outmaneuver, and outlast them. And as the Allied grip tightened around the shrinking Axis enclave in Tunisia, it became increasingly clear that the psychological battle was already over. The Desert Campaign, once defined by sweeping maneuvers and daring offensives, had become a war of mobility, and in that war the Allies held the undeniable advantage. By the spring of 1943, the North African campaign had reached its final and irreversible stage. The Axis enclave in Tunisia, once envisioned as a defensive stronghold capable of holding out indefinitely, was now collapsing under relentless Allied pressure. The German and Italian troops still fighting there were experienced, disciplined, and often superbly skilled. But they were increasingly isolated from supply, cut off from reinforcement, and forced to contend with an enemy whose ability to move and sustain operations had only grown stronger. In this final phase, the American Jeep did not decide battles by itself, but it played a crucial supporting role in nearly every Allied success, becoming a defining symbol of the logistical and operational superiority that ultimately secured victory. As the Allies tightened their encirclement around Tunis and Bizerta, the Jeep appeared everywhere. Reconnaissance teams used it to survey enemy withdrawal routes, identify choke points, and guide tank units toward weak spots in Axis defenses. Engineers used it to carry tools and explosives to critical bridges and crossroads. Liaison officers relied on it to maintain coordination between American, British, and French units, ensuring that advancing columns did not collide or lose momentum. In a campaign where timing and coordination were essential, the vehicle functioned as a moving nerve system. Axis reports from this period repeatedly mention the speed of Allied movement. German officers noted that the Americans in particular seemed capable of advancing with remarkable fluidity, shifting forces rapidly from one sector to another, reinforcing gaps before counterattacks could form, and exploiting opportunities with an energy that exceeded early expectations. The Jeep, already recognized by German observers as an unusually capable light vehicle, played a key part in enabling this tempo. It was the tool with which the Allies bridged the distances between units, brought reconnaissance into the field, and transported leaders across rugged ground. The rugged Tunisian terrain was especially challenging during the final weeks of the campaign. Heavy spring rains turned dry riverbeds into mud, and narrow mountain passes became treacherous. Larger vehicles often struggled in these conditions, but the Jeep continued to navigate the landscape with consistency. This allowed American forward observers to identify German fallback positions quickly, giving Allied artillery the accuracy needed to disrupt withdrawals and hamper defensive preparations. German accounts describe the disorienting experience of preparing to relocate, only to encounter precise Allied shelling that seemed to follow their movements. These effects were not accidental. They were the product of fast, mobile observation enabled in part by the Jeep. The vehicle's role in supply operations remained equally vital. As the Allies advanced farther from their ports, they needed to ensure that ammunition, rations, water, and medical equipment reached forward units in a timely manner. Supply officers used Jeeps to scout and monitor convoy routes, check on bottlenecks, and deliver small but urgent loads. The ability to keep supply lines flexible and responsive underpinned the Allies' ability to maintain constant pressure. Meanwhile, German supply lines were fragmented and overextended. Aerial bombardment, fuel shortages, and the destruction of transportation infrastructure meant that German units often went hours or days without reliable resupply. This logistical decline accelerated the collapse of Axis morale. The final battles for Tunis and Bizerte further illustrated the divergence between the two sides. The Allies were able to move combined arms formations with increasing precision, supported by continuous communication. Jeeps carried officers to observation rooftops, radio operators to critical hilltops, engineers to minefields, and stretcher teams to frontline casualties. These movements, seemingly mundane on their own, added up to a highly efficient, interconnected battlefield system. By contrast, many German units entered the final battles with limited motor transport and dwindling fuel. They often fought bravely, but their ability to reposition forces was severely restricted. Once an Allied breach occurred, the Axis lacked the means to respond before the gap widened. The psychological impact, already evident earlier in the year, now reached its peak. Soldiers knew that even well-executed defensive maneuvers were unlikely to succeed because the Allies could outpace them. The collapse came quickly. In early May 1943, the Allies broke through the last organized resistance around Tunis, capturing the city on May 7th. Bizerte fell the same day. Within a week, the remaining Axis forces across Tunisia surrendered in large numbers. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms, a defeat comparable in scale to the surrender at Stalingrad. For many of these troops, the realization had been forming long before the final shots were fired. The Allies' ability to move, supply, and coordinate their forces had become overwhelming. The Jeep, present in vast numbers during the final encirclement, witnessed the end of the campaign not as a machine of destruction, but as a facilitator of victory. It carried officers to negotiate surrenders, escorted prisoner columns, brought medical teams to newly secured towns, and helped restore order in devastated areas. Its presence in photographs from Tunis and Bizerte, dust-covered, loaded with equipment, surrounded by soldiers of multiple nations, captured the spirit of Allied cooperation and mobility that defined the campaign's conclusion. In retrospect, historians have noted that the Jeep did not win battles by itself, nor was it a decisive weapon in the traditional sense. But it embodied something essential: the ability of the United States and its allies to wage modern war as a coordinated, mobile, and adaptable force. The North African campaign demonstrated that victory depended not only on tanks, aircraft, or artillery, but on the system that tied them together. The Jeep, simple yet indispensable, became the most visible symbol of that system. When the Axis surrendered in Tunisia, they did so not only because they had been outmaneuvered, but because they had been outmobilized. And in the dusty roads of North Africa, where armies lived or died by their ability to move, no vehicle represented that reality more clearly than the Jeep. If this story moved you, don't forget to leave a like, because it helps this documentary reach even more people. Remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of history we bring to life here. And to show that you watched until the end, comment a single word related to our journey today. The word is mobility. Write it below, and I'll know you're part of those who value real history. Thank you for watching.